Hi guys, so I've now gone a bit grey silver because the yellow blonde was a bit too much for me. Anyway, forget that, let's carry on because we are in it at the minute. So one page 47 of this book, 117 of this book. And so far we've had Henry Jekyll trying to explain to us how great it was to be Hyde and how clever he was to separate Jekyll from Hyde so that if something happened to Jekyll he could continue to live his privileged lifestyle of having the nice house and all of those things. He almost got caught out with the trampling of the child, but after he sorted that out with his second signature and his second bank account, he thought that he was beyond the reach of fate, which is the last thing that I just read. So now he references the murder of Danvers Carew, and he starts to explain to us how it started to feel a little bit strange in himself. The time frame is quite difficult here because I'm sure that in my head there's quite a big time jump, but I'll have to go back and cross-reference it. I'm sure that somewhere in the earlier part, almost a year goes by. But anyway, this next bit, at the very top of page 47, just here, starts with, some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out on one of my adventures. So they've been called excursions and adventures, so it just sounds really fun. I want to go on those. I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain that I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognised the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. So, I've highlighted the bit where I've highlighted adventures, odd sensations, my room in the square. So my is still Henry Jekyll at this point, and he talks about how lovely it is and all the lovely things in it. But he doesn't feel quite right. There's something in him where it kind of feels like, even though we can see that it's Jekyll's room, it kind of feels like he's in Soho, in the other end of the other side of the house. But he kind of doesn't worry himself about it and smiles lazy to himself and sort of falls back in and out of sleep. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eye fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white and comely. But the hand which I now saw, clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor and thickly shaded with the swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. So he's gone to bed as Jekyll and has woken up in Jekyll's bed, and he thinks he's Jekyll, but when he looks down and sees his hand, which is kind of curled over like this, it's a hairy, muscular hand of Edward Hyde. Now, the things you need to highlight here, you've got the fact that Henry Jekyll's hand is professional. I mean, how can you have a professional hand? I'm not sure that's the thing. I suppose if you're talking about a labour market where wealthy people probably didn't do manual labour, so they don't have calluses and rough hands like a worker would have. So I suppose that's probably what he's talking about. So he's got this professional shape, size, they're large, firm, white and comely. He's got very lovely hands, does Dr. Jekyll. Now the description of Hyde's hands, I'd like you to put down on Edward Hyde's page, please. So they are lean, corded, which means you can kind of see all the muscles and things going up it. Knuckly, dusky pallor, thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair, so he's really hairy. Now you've got to remember, he's already described, when he described the murder of Danvers Carew is described as with an ape-like fury. This reference to apes increases as we get through this particular chapter, and we know it's related to the theory of evolution that had come out, and the Victorians were like, whoa, hang on a minute, so you mean we're not made in God's image? That means that we are part animal? That means we've got some basic instincts that we maybe can't control in a rational, civilised way. So the fact that his hand looks a bit like an ape's is important, and it's obvious. Okay, so he hasn't meant to turn into Edward Hyde. That's the point. So this is 2 months before the murder of Danvers Carew, okay? So we've got to get it timeline in our heads. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals. Please highlight that. I've circled terror. And bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. Ba, ba, ba. Please highlight that line. How could this be explained? I asked myself, and then, with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theatre, from where I was then standing. Oh gosh, I'm terrible today. Okay, so he's basically saying it's a really long journey, loads of stairs, etc., from where he's currently standing, horror struck. I just did a really bad job of reading that. I need to read the punctuation. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature, which is height, remember. And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed, as well as I was able in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and in such a strange array, and 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shave and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of breakfasting. So he kind of pretends to be interested in eating his breakfast, but obviously the real Henry Jekyll is stressing out because he woke up thinking he was Jekyll, so his mind is there and yet his body isn't, so it feels like there's a real loss of power, loss of control for him over all of this. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like a Babylonian finger. So that's like the finger of God getting comeuppance on the wall to be spelling out the letters of my judgment. Okay, so please highlight the simile like the Babylonian finger on the wall to be spelling out the letters of my judgment. The word judgment, we've had quite a lot of religious references so far. There's another one, the idea that God will judge us all in the end. And I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. The part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. Please highlight those 2 verbs. He's talking about Edward Hyde. So, you know, like when I said before that Edward Hyde is much smaller and skinnier and pale because he has not really been out in the daylight and he has not been exercised. The idea of building up a muscle, so he's like a muscle, has been exercised and nourished. That means he's been getting bigger. So in the margin there I've just written he's grown. So Edward Hyde has got bigger as a character, so maybe he's getting a bit more control over the body. Okay. And it seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood and began to spy a danger, please highlight that if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. So I've highlighted that whole line from the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown. So at the minute he feels like as Edward Hyde, as Jekyll, he has power to change into whichever form he wants, but he's actually genuinely really scared that waking up in the wrong body means that Edward Hyde might become his body forever. The power of the drug had not been always equally displayed. Once very early in my career it had totally failed me, since then I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once with infinite risk of death to treble the amount, and these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. So what he's saying is there have been occasions earlier on where the one dose was not enough to turn him back. He had to take a double, and there was one occasion where he had to take triple the dose, and he was terrified that he was just going to die because he didn't know he was overdosing. Really interesting, because we have to remember the context that the Victorians had a really big drug problem, big opiate problem. And as I'm sure you know from PSME and science and things, that with opiates you have to take more and more and more to get the same hit. So basically it's an addiction, and it's something that whilst the Victorians didn't openly acknowledge, it was a problem that society had, was a problem of addiction. And this idea that he's kind of addicted to being bad, and the drug is not hitting the spot anymore, and Hyde is getting too big and too powerful, so it takes more of the drug to control him, is something that I guess, you know, the educated masses reading this would recognise as something quite plausible. Obviously not turning into another human is plausible, but he's taken elements of real life and applied it to his fictional character, which just makes it, I guess, more believable. You're like, oh, yeah, okay. So Jekyll's pooping his pants right now. He's really scared that he's going to turn to Hyde and not be able to turn back in. Now, however, in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually, but decidedly, transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. So I have got a little star next to that here, and I've got that all highlighted in green. That needs to go on your Jekyll sheet, please. It's really important that he describes himself as his better self, and he describes his second as his worse. So now he's saying before it used to be quite painful to get rid of Jekyll, and now it's actually it's the other way. When he turns back into Jekyll, it's more of a difficult process. Between these two, I now felt I had to choose. Please highlight. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, meaning he's made up of both things, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with the greedy gusto projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll. So please highlight that Hyde is indifferent. So we've got a real dangerous balance here, because if Hyde was all bad and Jekyll was all good, that's kind of equal, but what you've got is Hyde is really bad, Jekyll is part good, but there's actually still the bad bit of him, and he's actually projecting and sharing in the pleasures of Hyde. So Jekyll is enjoying being bad when he's Hyde, and Hyde is enjoying being bad. So it almost feels like there's less good than there was before in him. Does that make sense? And he uses a really good metaphor here, which is one that you need to write down as a metaphor. You need to write it down on your Jekyll sheet, and it's one that I would recommend trying to learn. So last bit I read was, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. So Hyde, the only way he thinks about Jekyll is like, well, I kind of need him. He's my place to hide when I need to get away from the police. So this is the metaphor. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. So by using the father-son metaphor, he's kind of implying that Jekyll has a vested interest and tries to guide and do all the things that a father would do, and Hyde has a son's indifference. So imagine a massively stereotyping, but like a teenage son who's like, yeah, whatever, Dad, what do you know? So Hyde is dismissive of anything Jekyll might think or say or do, and on the flip side, Jekyll's almost too involved, and maybe that's not helpful. So, to cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had of late begun to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become, at a blow and forever, despised and friendless. So these are his options. They don't sound great. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales. For while Jekyll could suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would be not even conscious of all that he lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner. And it fell out with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part, and was found wanting in the strength to keep to it. So he makes this decision, instead of being despised and friendless, which doesn't sound great, he realises he's got to choose. He can't be both things anymore. It's not going to work. So I've highlighted the line that says, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man, and the alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner. So he's, again, using biblical language, the idea that somebody needs to take away the temptation, because it will leave the sinner trembling if they end up